BBC4 Collections, specially chosen programmes from the BBC archive. For this collection, Max Hastings has selected interviews with Great War veterans filmed in the 1960s. More programmes on this theme and other BBC4 collections are available on BBC iPlayer.
This was the first time I'd actually commanded a tank in action, and I was petrified. I hoped the whole way up that I should sprain my ankle or something like that, that we should never get there, or the whole thing would be called off. We had no luck at all, and the ghastly hour got nearer and nearer. And the worst moment of all was when we started up our engines, and they would backfire. And you got a sheet of flame out of the exhaust, everybody calling each other a bloody fool and waiting to know what was going to happen. However, nothing did happen, and we climbed into the tank. The garrismen got into their places, and then the side gunners got in, and then the driver gets in, and then the officer gets in through the top, and we started off. We had to close down because we were within very comfortable machine gun range. And once we were shut down, we were completely isolated from the world. We had no means of communication at all. The thing got hotter and hotter and hotter. The only ventilation was concerned with the engine and not with the crew. You could only see forward through a little slit in the front visor. And if you wanted to see out the side, you looked through steel periscopes, which gave you a sort of translucent outside light, all distorted. And the tank inside itself was just steeped in Stygian gloom. It was all gloomy, hot and steamy. And my particular tank never went until the engine had boiled. And once it had boiled, you kept it boiling, and it was jolly good. It went on quite well after that. The noise inside was such that you could hear nothing outside at all. And people made little gestures to you, rude or otherwise. That was all you could do. Your sole means of communicating. When this barrage came down, you could distinguish that quite easily, because any shell bursting within a few yards of the tank got tremendous back pressure, and you felt it all the way through. In fact, a shell bursting between the horns of the tank seemed to lift it up in the air. And then the machine guns started, and they were quite easy to discern, because they were just like peas on a tin can, rattling away. Well, we moved up to our tanks in the lying up area by St. Julian farmhouse in the middle of the night. And then we had to brew up and unsheeted, did our pre-battle maintenance, that loaded our guns, and saw that everything was shipshape. And then took our camouflage nets off. And then we warmed our engines up, and then we started to get ready to go off, hoping nothing was going to happen. Nothing did happen. It was a dead quiet night. There was hardly any machine gun fired, no shelling at all, and it gradually got light, and we moved off at 6 o'clock for 6:15:0. There were 10 tanks there. Only one failed to start, and he never lived it down, of course, but poor chap, it wasn't his fault, it was the engine. We went off line ahead. My own tank was the 4th, the 3 ahead and 6 behind, if my arithmetic's right. We moved off at 100 yards interval. It then turned into a really cold, beastly drizzle, which made these pavé sets frightfully slippery. They were like ice. And as our tracks very nearly spanned the causeway, we had to go very, very, very carefully. I was so windy that we went too cautiously, and we lost the 3 in front. And we went jogging along, and after a bit we came round a corner, and there I saw 2 of them stuck. There was an enormous tree across the road. The Germans had taken a habit of blowing up the trees. Whether it's shell fire or the Germans, I don't know, but it was some tree. And the only way to take the tree was to climb over it. The first tank had got away with it, and he'd gone on ahead. The second tank had slid off, possibly on account of the mud left on the tracks of the first tank, and he was sideways off the pave, quite out of action. The second one was stuck half across, and that presented a problem because he was obstructing the road and he couldn't get on. And we got out and had a talk. It was still perfectly quiet, no shelling, no noise at all. And he agreed to really sacrifice himself. He drove his tank off into the mud, and that cleared the road for me. And I had a first-class driver, and he was with consummate skill. He got over the log. He drove up it and then swung slightly right, so that he was directly at right angles to it, and dropped down with a frightful crash on the path at the other side, and we were off. That delayed us about 20 minutes, and we'd only got about another 10 minutes along the road when I thought the world had come to an end. We ran straight into the counter-barrage of the Boche. He'd evidently seen our leading tank, which was somewhere ahead, and we caught it. It was quite... I'd never been so frightened in my life. I think everybody was. The blues and reds and yellows, all the pyrotechnic colours in the world. And then there was a most almighty crash, and a sheet of flame came up from the starboard side, and we'd had direct hit. My driver was his side, and he got out his extinguisher, and he put the fire out, and then we had to look around, and of course the engine was completely broken up, and we were immobile in the middle of the road. The shelling was still going on. It was still, if anything, more intense, and we were being machine gunned. Well, we had a drill then. You evacuate a tank just like saying you evacuate an airplane. I had 3 men wounded. One had got his leg blown off, and he died later on that night. And we got the whole lot out with the tank between us and the Germans, and then sat down to take stock, because we didn't know what to do exactly. Then looming out of this murk came the tank behind me. It was commanded by a great friend of mine. I stopped him. We crawled out and told him what had happened. He didn't stand a hope of getting on. If he'd gone off the pavey, he would have stuck too. We had no communication at all. Well, one could only shout to each other. And we decided the best thing to do was to go back and warn the others to avoid a complete debacle. I got my crew inside the second tank. There were 16 of us in the tank then. And the driver of that tank was again a very skillful man. He eased that tank round on that 10-foot causeway. It was the most extraordinary feat. Got it round, and away we went back. We'd gone on for a few hundred yards, and there we saw why there was no other tank coming. The whole lot was stuck on this tree trunk. They'd all gone round. They were all ditched. One had had a direct hit, and there was the company. Well, then we had to make our mind what we were going to do. We put on the unditching beam. That has rather short chains to the tracks, and so if you want to turn round, you have to carry out a very wide sweep indeed, because the variation in the track steering is so slight. Well, of course, we got stuck, and the only thing to do then was to call it a day. And I got my crew out. We walked back and found a duckboard track to a dressing station. We were very lucky in finding a very gallant team of RAMC stretcher bearers who no like to be up there at all, but they took on this poor chap with the leg off and took charge of him, and we went back and evacuated our wounded, and then went back to the lying up area, where I expected to get an almighty rocket from my company commander, said which he was delighted to see me. He thought we'd all been written off, and so we turned out as pocket heroes in the end. The interesting thing about the front tank, it only got round the corner from me when it was also hit and broke a track, and they had to evacuate too. So that meant that 10 tanks were written off and 9 written off. None were recovered, and nothing was achieved at all. And that was the last tank attack in the Passchendaele battle. After the conclusion of the Passchendaele debacle, as far as tanks were concerned, there was a serious consideration whether they should wash them out altogether, or whether they could use them in some other shape or form. And the tank people put up a plea to have one big attack on good going, open terrain, with all the tanks they'd got. And after a good deal of argument, that was accepted. And we all moved south, where we concentrated and refitted and got equipped with things called fascines. The attack was to be made in the Cambrai area, and the German line there was known as the Hindenburg line, was over 12 feet deep. And everyone was frightened that the tank tails would slip when they were coming out and they'd get ditched. So we fitted ourselves with the fascines, which weighed 1.5 tons, carried them on the top of the tanks, and the plan was to drop them in the trench, stop the tail dropping. Well, we got that fixed up, and then we moved up to a place called Haverincourt Wood, which was within 2,000 yards of the German front line. The move was made at night, and dead slow. We went a mile an hour, and everything seemed to be going well, till some silly arse had got his valise on top of the tank on the exhaust pipe, and that caught fire. And of course the whole column stopped, and there was almost a court-martial on the spot. However, we went on, nobody saw it, the Germans didn't, and we crept in undercover, camouflaged ourselves, and observed the strictest possible precautions about secrecy. There were no fires by day or night. We brewed up inside the tanks, which was quite prohibited, and the troops were really more uncomfortable than the officers, because the officers did get out in small batches to make a reconnaissance. And there, for the first time in our lives, we saw a battlefield which was completely unscarred. Everybody pointed out where the enemy were. You could see damn all nothing, except an enormous belt, great big black mass, which was heavy barbed wire. The German trenches were about 1,000 yards away, and by 5:30, we were all lined up in the front trenches with our gear, ready to go, consumed with anxiety, because the rum and soup that a fat sergeant cook Tootsie Hands had promised hadn't arrived. Thank God it came before we started, and then it was too hot to drink. We started off to come out of Haverincourt Wood the night before the attack, crawling along very quietly, very carefully along taped lines which had been put out beforehand. And no sooner we got clear of the wood, everybody sweating on the top line, the gunners came in. They made a filthy noise, jingling, and the horses making noises both ends. And it was altogether a matter of great concern for those of us who were going to battle. However, nothing happened. We got up onto our starting places, and the plan very roughly was to go forward in 3 lines, and with 320 tanks on the same frontage as Passchendaele. The zero was 6:15, and the first tanks were due off at 6 o'clock, and we went off on time. It was really quite exciting, because we'd had an awful pacing up at Passchendaele. We knew there was no end result, but here did seem something worthwhile going for. We got in, shut down our tanks, and away we went. We had rough compasses in the tanks, and we got our course, and we set course for the enemy line. The first thing that happened was all dead silent. There wasn't a word until we got to the enemy wire, which was 0 hour for the guns. And that, again, was a first-class show. The Crystal Palace had nothing in it at all. It was no answer from the Germans at all, and it was the first time in our lives we saw the Hun being blown up all over the place, bits of thing going everywhere. The troops were frightfully pleased. No machine gun fires. We opened up our tanks, and then we got into this belt of wire. It was quite terrifying, because it was about 7 feet high, very, very thick wire, and it was over 120 yards deep in places. And, of course, if we'd have stopped in that or got our tracks ripped off, then we should have been for it. Instead of that, the tanks made great swathes in the wire, and the jocks who were playing with us, they came through the gaps we'd made, and we all emerged the other side into a deep valley known as the Grand Ravine. Before we got there, we had to cross this Hindenburg line, and each tank worked, the tanks worked in groups of 3. The first tank dropped his machine in, the 2 other tanks crossed in over it, and then when they came to the second line, the second tank dropped his, and the 3 crossed over, and they left 1 in reserve. And we all arrived, every tank as far as I could see, at the Grand Ravine. There was a most extraordinary sight. The Germans had just finished breakfast. They were completely taken by surprise. They were running about, their hands up, hands down, hands everywhere. And we collected them and sent them back. The jocks took on the prisoners because we couldn't do it. And we had a wait there of 15 minutes to enable the barrage to lift and people to sort themselves out. And we had anticipated a great deal of trouble, which never materialized. So we had this pause, which was very unfortunate in the after event. My crew got out for a smoke and to have a look round. And when the time came to go on, I found I had no crew at all. They were all looting. However, we got them back. I had 2 men from Scotland in the crew. They came back with pistols, binoculars, and all sorts of things. I was furious with rage, so they presented the best pair to me, and off we went again. And we got pulled out of the Grand Ravine, and the accompanying jocks were getting a bit tired by this time, because we'd come quite a long way, and we went up the slope towards a place called Flakier. And here the thing wasn't quite such a cakewalk. we met batches of Germans who were firing machine guns. We accounted for those, but they did hold up the accompanying infantrymen. And then I noticed on the right that 1 or 2 tanks were going up in flames. And when the one on my immediate right went up, I thought the time had come to steer a little left. And we found afterwards that I'd run into the battery manned by the German major who shot out 7 of our British tanks with 1 other crew to help him. He was mentioned in Haig's book. We then went on further up the top and came to the Flakier Ridge with its thick belt of trees, which were getting rather difficult to get through. And here we met the most intense machine gun fire. It was so hot one had to completely close down, and we had no infantry accompanying us then. They'd fallen back on account of exhaustion, and there were insufficient reserves to come through, and so we were just tanks prowling around in a wood, which didn't do any good at all. Eventually I had 3 men wounded, and then I was wounded myself, and then we got short of petrol, so we decided to go back to our rallying point to refuel and refill. Halfway back I ran into the commanding officer, and I thought I should get a rocket, and he looked at my tank and told me that I'd better go back to the lying up place. And we got to a village called Traco, and there I ran into an Indian cavalry brigade. It was a most extraordinary sight. The first time I'd ever seen a horsed cavalry brigade ready for action, and they were waiting for orders, which unfortunately they never got. And I found out what had happened to the tank. The front visor was cut right through by machine gun fire. The rails were both hanging down. They'd been cut through by machine gun fire. And the front Lewis gun, the barrel itself was bent, so intense had the machine gun fire been. And the louvers, which are the side of the tank, protect the engines, where you get the ventilation from, they were cut to ribbons. And so I left my tank and go to hospital, and the tank went to hospital too. And that was the end of combat.
And cut.